Okay, good morning everyone and welcome to the Fields COVID-19 seminar. I will hand you over to Kumar Murthy, our director from Fields, who will welcome our speaker.
Okay, welcome everybody and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. This weekly seminar where we bring together modelers, mathematicians, epidemiologists, and so on to tell us about the latest work related to the pandemic. Absolutely delighted to welcome Chris Budd from the University of Bath, who will speak about COVID, V-KEMs, and modeling retail and higher education. Chris, please.
Well, thank you, Kumar. It's a very great pleasure to come all the way over to Toronto from University of Bath. I'm just very sad that I can't be with you in person, but I'm very pleased still to be able to be with you by Zoom. I love coming over to Canada and was at the Fields Institute quite recently in just before lockdown, but who knows when I'll be able to come to see you next again. I do hope it won't be too long. So what I'm going to do today is tell you about V-KEMs, which is an organisation that's been set up in the UK to help do problem solving associated with COVID, and a couple of the projects that V-KEMs has been working on, particularly to do with retail and higher education in the UK. So I'd be kind of interested to see what parallels there might be over in Canada. And just to say that this is joint work with Matt Butchers from the KTN, I'll say who they are in a minute, and various other bodies in the UK, including the ICMS and the Isaac Newton Institute, which are essentially UK mirror images of the Fields Institute. Okay, so the contents of this talk, I'll tell you a bit about the V-KEMs organisation, then the sort of mathematical and modelling meat of the talk will be to look at the work of V-KEMs in retail and higher education. And then I'll finish off the talk saying a little bit more about V-KEMs and talk about maybe ways that we can work together between the UK and Canada. So basically in March, the UK went into lockdown. I imagine Canada went into lockdown at a similar sort of time. And it was felt amongst the mathematical community that a lot of the knowledge exchange activity, which many of the UK mathematicians were heavily involved with, should continue, both to continue with the various projects we're always involved with in collaboration with industry, but also to see whether we can harness the collective experience and knowledge exchange in the entirety of the UK community to try to tackle the problems related to COVID-19. Not so much in epidemiology, because they're really good experts doing that, but a lot of the sort of problems that relate to COVID as a result of the epidemiology. So a group of us got together, and here is the kind of executive committee to coordinate this effort. And just to say who the various bodies are involved, so David Abrahams on the top left is the director of the Isaac Newton Institute, which is in Cambridge and is exactly similar to the Fields Institute. And then Caroline is colleague of mine at Bath. Matt Butchers is a guy who works for what's called the Knowledge Transfer Network, which is a governmental body in the UK, which has been set up specifically to collaborate and bring knowledge together from universities into the broader community and industry. Alan Champneys is the University of Bristol, Rebecca Hall, University of Southampton, Jo Jordan at, she's a freelance, Jane Leeks and Claire also at the Isaac Newton Institute, and Dawn Wasley, who is the chief executive for the ICMS, which is the direct equivalent of the Fields Institute, but based in Edinburgh. So this is very much a collaboration between academia, the kind of research centres, and government. However, the great thing about virtual working, which is what we now have to do, of course, is that it knows no boundaries. And the pretty well everywhere in the UK has become involved with the work of V-KEMs in the sort of tackling the problems related to COVID. And I rather hope that as a result of this seminar, I can encourage Canada to become a partner for the work that we do as well. So here's a rough diagram of the kind of mathematical response in the UK to the pandemic. So at the bottom of this is the great community of academic mathematicians in the UK, which includes epidemiologists, it includes mathematical modelers such as myself, it includes statisticians, and we certainly shouldn't forget pure mathematicians as well. Then there's the kind of infrastructure in the UK, which has the national centres like the Isaac Newton Institute, the ICMS, the KTN, and the Royal Society. And then there are three bodies that have really been sort of set up to work on kind of projects related to COVID. On the left, there's RAMP, which is the Rapid Action Platform for Pandemics, which the Royal Society set up. The IDP, which is an ongoing program at the Isaac Newton Institute, which is the infectious disease program, and I suspect mirrors activity at the Fields. And then V-KEMs, which is the body that I'm involved with, which stands for the Virtual Forum for Knowledge Exchange in the Mathematical Sciences. And then the various projects that are going on in these bodies then get fed into SPI-M, which is the Scientific Panel for Influenza Modeling, and its related panel, the Scientific Panel for Influenza Biology, which collates all the science together and feeds into SAGE, which is the Scientific Advice to Government for Emergencies. And then SAGE works with government, who may or may not do anything that the scientists advise. So that's kind of the structure of the way things are working at the moment. And in fact, as soon as I finish this meeting, I'm hopping into a SPI-M meeting on the rather urgent and timely and related topic of COVID in higher education in the UK, of which I'm going to say a bit about in this seminar. So that's the basic structure. And as I say, V-KEMs was set up as a virtual forum to allow mathematicians to work very actively and rapidly on problems coming out of COVID, whether they be epidemiological or related to COVID in the workplace, or COVID related things like logistics or food supply or anything like that. So having set up V-KEMs, it was decided that it would kind of do three main types of activities. One was the kind of business as usual type of activity of hosting meetings, running webinars and so on. The third is to continue with the mathematical support to business industry in the third sector, which again is kind of the bread and butter of knowledge exchange mathematics. But the third area is something I kind of particularly want to talk to you about, which is running virtual study groups. Now, I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with study groups, but I know for a fact that Fields is, because I've been to several outfields. In Canada, these are called industrial problem solving workshops. And a study group is an activity typically lasting a week or so, where groups of mathematicians work together in teams on focused problems with the idea of actually delivering results and reports within very, very tight frameworks. So it's a way of getting mathematicians to work together, and the Fields Institute certainly has run many of these, and in fact I've attended quite a lot of them. The idea behind V-KEMs in this context was to take the study group model, this model of focusing mathematicians working together in teams, and to apply it to tackle the problems arising in COVID. And when I say mathematicians, I don't mean just mathematicians. So it'll be mathematicians working with epidemiologists, working with social scientists, working with economists, and anyone relevant to the problems that were being addressed in the study group. So here's a typical virtual study group in action. So it's a Zoom meeting where we would probably have about 80 mathematicians working together for about a week, and then you'd subdivide into different groups to tackle sub-problems in a more focused way, and then we would basically meet up as a whole group twice a day to make sure you get continuity across the whole meeting. And Zoom's proved actually a very stable platform for doing this on. The breakout room facility is very effective in allowing conversations, and providing you then combine it with ways of doing mathematics at kind of long distance. So typically we've been using tools like HackMD, Overleaf and so on to transmit mathematical information around the group. It has been remarkably effective as a way of problem solving. And what I basically want to talk to you today about is some of the problems that have been tackled in these virtual study groups and are being planned to be tackled in future virtual study groups. So the basic framework that V-KEMs then operates is firstly to talk to the end users that typically those might be people that are directly impacted by COVID, such as retail operators, who and identify problems that need to be tackled. It then does a degree of problem triage. So it identifies which of the problems which may be amenable to solution. It identifies problem facilitators that would be people with a reasonable amount of knowledge of the subject that can guide the discussions in each breakout room. It identifies then participants amongst the entire body of UK mathematics who could get involved, or indeed much further abroad, and then actually runs the virtual study group. And if anyone is interested in running such a thing themselves, I co-wrote an operations manual for running one of these things, and you can download that from the V-KEMs website, which I'll give at the end of this talk. So since April, when we kind of got going, we've been pretty active in running a large number of different types of workshop. So we had a pilot followed by a second workshop on unlocking the workforce, followed by a series of follow-up meetings with SPI-M. Then we looked at issues to do with food. Then another study group on unlocking higher education. Then another one on food and the logistics to that. Then a series of follow-up meetings with SPI-M, UUK's Universities UK, Department for Education, and so on. Then last month, we had one on evaluating the UK's resistance to supply chain problems caused by COVID. And then unfortunately, we're having to start running new ones on how we're dealing with the current significant resurgence that we're seeing in COVID-19, certainly in the UK, and I presume in Canada as well. And the next one we're going to run, which will be next week, will be to look at impact of COVID on rail transport. So I'd like to now take you through some of the actual more like sort of science, scientific aspects of what we do, to talk about the topics that have been covered in two of the workshops and which have had significant follow-up ever since. So way back in May, we ran a workshop called Unlocking the Workforce. At that time, the UK was in complete lockdown and nothing was moving at all. You couldn't really even easily go into the shops. And so we started to plan ahead to try to model how it might be possible to get the UK moving again and to get the schools, universities and the shops open. So we called that Unlocking the Workplace. And in the kind of thinking about planning this workshop, we decided that in the workplace situation, there were basically 4 types of situation that you might encounter. Interactions where you have kind of relatively long interactions with people, but closed, so a closed community, but long interactions. And an example of that would be a care home, which is particularly relevant to me because my daughter works for a charity which runs care homes. The second one would be a long interaction with an open community, so you're not quite sure who's going to be in that. And an example of that might be a train traveling from London to Scotland, where you might be on the same train for 6 hours. So there's plenty of time to get infected in that time. Then you can have interactions which are short and closed. So it's a closed group of people, but for a relatively short amount of time. So a good example of that would be a lecture in a university, and I'll talk about those in a minute. And then finally, interactions which are short, but with an open group. And that's typically what happens when you go into a shop. So these are the 4 that we looked at. I'm going to talk particularly about short and open about shopping, and then short and closed about lecturing. But if anyone's interested, they can have a look at the reports that we wrote on these 4 different topics. And here they are. Well, here's some of them. Again, these can all be downloaded from the V-KEMs website. The one on the left, Guiding Principles for Unlocking the Workshop, What Can Mathematics Tell Us, worked its way all the way up to Sage and had a reasonable impact in guiding government. And on the right is paper I'm going to talk about, which is Assessing Risk in the Retail Environment, which is going through the works with the Royal Society. And there's a middle one by my friend Alan Champneys and various other people about general principles of operating in a safe workplace. And I say these can all be downloaded from the V-KEMs website. So let me talk about COVID-19 and retail. And this is joint work that I did both during the workshop, and then we've worked quite a lot ever since with 3 other people that I didn't meet before the workshop, but we formed a collaboration at the workshop, and that collaboration's continued very strong ever since. Kieran Calvert's at Manchester, Sam Johnson's at Birmingham, and Sam Tickle is at the University of Bristol. So what's the context? Well, the context is, of course, that everyone needs to go shopping. And when we first started talking about this, the shopping was in a bit of a mess because everyone had raided all the shops and their shelves were completely empty, and internet shopping had completely broken down because it had got completely overloaded. But even so, we started to think forward as to what would go ahead, and have identified various principles as a result of the mathematical modeling. So typically when you go into a store, you queue outside and then are let in, typically in a fairly controlled way. And 2 issues arise in the store. You move around and choose your goods. And then at the end of the store, you have to queue to be served. Although in some places like Starbucks, for example, the whole process is of queuing. So the question is, how safe is this? How can we model it? And as a result of the modeling, can we give some basic guidelines to the stores to how they might want to operate in a high-risk COVID environment? So general principles. Firstly, it turns out from the modeling that the key thing is to minimize interaction time. A lot of stores being putting in one-way systems to reduce number of contacts. That seems actually to be not the safest thing to do. It's much better to minimize interaction time between contacts. And secondly, it really, really does make a difference to wear PPE, both shoppers and storekeepers. I know that's fairly obvious, but that's actually been quite a controversial thing in the UK to implement. How do we reach these conclusions? Well, for moving around, there are a number of things that you might want to do. Firstly, you want to have a look at the chances of individuals getting infected, and you can have two scenarios. You assume that there is some individual that is carrying infection, who's in the middle, and two other people, one that's walking past relatively fast at a distance small delta from this infected individual, another one which is more stationary at a distance big D. So loosely speaking, the top represents free movement within the shop, and the second would represent a queue or more structured motion. And you can model this relatively straightforwardly. You get infected at probability PE, where that's related to the dose that you get, and the dose that you get is dependent on your distance from the infected person and how long you spend close to that infected person. And you can we subcontracted to RAMP, the Royal Society group, which has various models for the dose that you get a distance R from an infected person, assuming that the infection is largely based in aerosols in the atmosphere. And these are the results you get. So these are curves for different distances, showing basically separating whether you're more likely to get infected if you're standing below the curve or walking past above the curve. And these show quite clearly that if you have a sort of certain critical distances, then it's generally safer to pass by closely than to stand for a long time. So, and these conclusions are relatively robust to the type of law that you have. So it seems like an inverse cube law is one model that's quite often used, and with an inverse cube law, it's safer to be 50 centimeters away than to stand, even if you're a further distance away. So a guiding principle from this dose calculation was that walking past seems better in most circumstances. So that's just the interaction between two people. Then once you're in the store, you're not on your own, of course. There are many other people in the store, and you may want to simulate that. And we tried simulating that using an agent-based model. And those of you who are familiar with crowds motion, there's a thing called the Helbing model, which is really quite widely used and well tested, which says that the acceleration, you have a number of actors indexed by alpha that have velocity v, and the acceleration of each person depends upon a number of forces. So you have they can't walk through walls, they can't walk through each other. They have to have a sort of social distance, that's FSD, and they are attracted as they go around the store to various points in the store, which are consistent with some sort of shopping list that they may have, although you build randomness into that because not everyone goes through a store exactly with their shopping list. They may well double back on themselves, or indeed not know where things are in the store, and that causes a certain amount of stochasticity. And then you combine the ABM with a diffusion model for virus transport, so that the rate of the dose that you get of the virus, d by dt of sigma alpha, is proportional to the rate at which you inhale aerosols divided by either an inverse square law or an inverse cube law. In fact, it doesn't really make much difference to the conclusions as to which you get. So this is the basic model that we have for shopping. These are typical simulations of a single aisle in a store. Of course, in a store you have a more complicated geometry, and that can be simulated just as easily. And you can see in this, the shop is moving around, not going through walls, interacting with each other in a certain way. What you can't quite see on this is the way people are moving according to their preferences. So here's a simulation of 3 different types of shopper in a store. The first one has a clear idea of what they want to do, and is moving through the store in a kind of ordered way according to their shopping list. The second one has a less clear idea what they want to do, and having a certain amount of random motion and coming back with themselves. And the third one is, again, not quite sure what they want to do, but they're in a store where they are forced to basically go in one direction. So these are the 3 types of shopping scenario that we decided to try to model. And if you do this, then the results are kind of interesting. So we ran a large number of simulations with different types of shopper behaving in different types of way, and with various social distancing laws built in. And on the left, we have the kind of dose, the exposure that you get if you have a very structured shopping environment, and on the right, the exposure you get if you have free movement. And the conclusion from this was that free movement is in general rather better than structured shopping. The reason basically being the reason I said at the beginning of this discussion, which is that if you move past someone quickly, you pick up less of a dose than if you hang around someone that's near to you. So that was a conclusion, the motion through the shop. Then we also modeled the what happens when you get to the end of the shop, where you're typically going in a queue, where you're going to be interacting with shoppers in the queue and also with the servers. And of course, this would also be a model of something like Starbucks. And again, how do you model that? Well, there's the great body of queuing theory, which allows you to model the way queues operate under certain assumptions. And we looked at various types of queuing example, again, to see what the effect of everything was. Essentially, you have a base case where there's a certain level of PPE and a certain level of interaction, and the clear conclusions for this, all pretty obvious, I would imagine, but it's nice to see mathematical backup from this, was that it's absolutely essential if you're in a queuing environment to have masks either on the customers or on the servers, and as much safety as you can put for the servers as possible, because there is really a much more significant chance of viral contamination in the queue. And the more queues, the better, because that reduces the average time in a queue. The difficulty of having more servers is it's economically harder for the shop. And also, it's not easy to guarantee you're going to have a lot of servers when there's always the danger of isolation. A server having to go into isolation, which unfortunately is getting more and more significant in the UK, and I'd imagine in Canada as well. But all of these conclusions can be sort of modelled and to a certain extent rigorously justified by using queuing theory.
Chris, it's Jiang Ho.
Yeah.
How much time you allow interruption during a lecture?
In the queue? In
the queue, in the last slide, are you allowed?
Well, we modelled it for various types of interaction, and typically relatively short interaction times, but people you could be standing in a queue for about 10 minutes.
Okay, thank you very much, Chris.
So the second thing I'd like to talk about, which again came out of the third big workshop that we ran, which was in June, was unlocking higher education. And this is very, very much an ongoing subject. And I should say that my own situation is that I work at the University of Bath. The University of Bath has got what's called blended learning. So it means that all our lectures are being done online, but tutorials are being done face-to-face. So I see my students face-to-face once a week in groups of about 25. So that's what my own university is doing. And the UK universities came back at the end of September, and we've been seeing a significant number of cases of COVID contamination within them. So I wanted to talk about that. So this workshop was originally, I say, done in June. So I want to kind of take you historically through, because it gives you a way of sort of comparing the way the modelling started to think about things with actually then what happened. We felt that when you're modelling at a university, there are basically three things to look at 3 different scales. One is to look at the scale of a lecture theatre. How can we most safely lecture to our students? Lecturing in this context meaning tutorials of about 20 or 30 students. Secondly, how can we most safely work with the students when they're on campus, assuming that they're going to be in accommodation, and many of them in campus or using university facilities. And thirdly, this very politically charged problem of what happens within the community. Are our students going to be seen as bringers of infection to the whole community, or indeed of taking infection back from the university to their homes if they go home at Christmas? So these are kind of the issues that are very much at the forefront of our minds at the moment, looking at university accommodation results. So first calculation was just to look at the relative risks of staff and students. And you can kind of get quite a reasonable way along doing this, just doing kind of statistical models, or so we thought. The main problem with universities isn't so much for the students catching it, it's for someone like me catching it, because the chances of dying go up a factor of 10 every 20 years. So those of us like me who are in their 60s are hugely more at risk than a student who is 20. So the key thing to do really is to try to have a university system which is going to keep risk particularly for staff as low as possible, and also to be robust if the if the staff themselves have to go into isolation because of catching or being tracked to be close to someone that has had COVID. So various statistical calculations that were done. I move on to this picture. These were the estimates that we were making in June, and I'll compare them with actually what happened. Based on various rates at the time, it was estimated from kind of statistical calculations that about 5 staff would get infected a week in a worst case, and about 22 students per week, with about I suppose 700, about 300 infections per semester, and a very small number of deaths. Interesting enough, in terms of deaths, it's been rather morbidly calculated that the risk to students due to mental health problems, the risk of them committing suicide due to mental health problems during COVID is actually higher than the risk of them dying COVID, which is a rather morbid statistic, but there it is. And that's one of the reasons that face-to-face teaching is continuing in England. However, there is, as I said, a much more significant risk to health of staff. Anyway, these were statistical measures that were done during the summer as part of our planning. Unfortunately, these proved to be significant underestimates. These are the current statistics in the UK for my own university. So these are pretty up to date. I didn't get the values for yesterday, but my own university, we see that whilst the number of cases amongst the staff are relatively low, we're getting something like 20 cases a day amongst our students. And so there's a possibility at the end of this semester that in my own university, we may have something like 3,000 students that have been tested positive for COVID, which is quite a sobering number. Also, the other statistic I can say about my university is roughly a half of the students are currently in isolation in one way or the other, and that's due to not them having it, but being in taking no risk and in their accommodation. If one member gets it, we put the rest of the accommodation to isolation. So these numbers turned out to be rather higher, and the basic reason for that is the R number in the UK is about 1.7, and no one really thought it would get up that high, or at least no one told us it would get up that high when we were doing our original planning. Okay, having said that, let's see what did actually prove to be quite effective calculation. So the work I was particularly involved with, I should say, by the way, that my day job is, I'm not an epidemiologist in any sense, but I do a lot of work in environmental modelling and have a certain amount of expertise in that sort of area. So that's kind of what I was concentrating on. So the smallest scale that we might be interested in higher education is looking at the level of, say, a lecture theatre or a tutorial. And there you can kind of sort of make some sort of meaningful suggestions. So this is a typical lecture theatre at Bath. It's actually the room I actually lecture in. And that's a lecture theatre set up for about 80 people. And currently, rather than 80 people, we are taking about 20 in that room. So they're much more spread out, and the tables are much more spread out. So that was a picture taken before we put in the COVID distancing regulations. But that is the actual room in which I teach. Okay, so this is a calculation we did. How should, if I'm teaching there for a certain number of hours per week, 2 hours or maybe 4 hours, depending upon the class, what's the best way to do this? And this is something you can actually model reasonably well. You can model things like the ventilation in the room. You've got a reasonable model for the breathing of the students and the inhaling of the students and of the lecturer. And you also got models for how the infection is likely to spread around. And so these could all be combined in to kind of look at the impact of different types of class size and class length in the lecture theatre, and decide whether it's better to teach the students in one spread so they get hammered to death in one day, or whether they should take shorter lectures and spread them out over several classes. And the conclusion from that was essentially that longer classes turned out, if you're going to go for reasonable class size, not to be too bad, especially if you've got fairly active levels of talking and interaction. And the breaking up into shorter classes, whilst initially good for larger class sizes due to basically the superlinear infection rate, starts to be counterproductive fairly quickly. And this was we were able to give specific advice. And in fact, the classes in Bath on the whole are quite long now. We give them 4-hour classes. The data for this was largely drawn from the work of RAMP, which I serve on as well, which one of the great things that applied mathematicians in the UK do know about is fluid mechanics, and therefore there's a lot of expertise that we're able to draw on. And for those of you who like these sort of things, this is the kind of model that has proved quite effective, the Gametoni-Nucci equation, which allows you to estimate the number of people that are likely to get infected. It's an SIR, essentially an SIR model, but it has built into it a lot of extra stuff to do with aerosol transmission and aerosol contamination. That model was then implemented, and that together with various numbers to do with the room ventilation and the kind of droplet projection rate and breathing rates and so on. And it was that model that allowed us then to produce these graphs of the different types of infection rate for the different types of lecture and different types of room and class size. So if anyone's interested, all of this is in the report on the V-KEMs website on higher education, which was then developed into quite a serious report, which went all the way up to government as well, and was also used to inform university leaders across the country. We combine this with a separate model looking at the effects of surface cleaning. So to do this, we again assume that students are going to move around a bit and contaminate surfaces in various ways, and over a few hours, because the infection rates, well, the decay rates of infection on surfaces last for, well, start again. It takes quite a long time for the contamination to go away on a surface, and so we had various models for decay on surfaces, which allowed us to again look at the impact of how long you stay in a lecture and the impact of cleaning. And it was very clear from that that cleaning is absolutely essential, and that's another reason why we're going for fairly long lecture times. So a student would be in a room for 4 hours, and then that room would be taken out of service for several days to be properly cleaned. And again, that's following from these kind of stochastic models. The third thing we looked at was the motion of students within the lecture theatres. So this sort of related quite a lot to the earlier work that we did in supermarkets, where you've got people walking around in the store in a crowd. And actually that's not a problem. The clear evidence from the earlier modelling is that students walking past each other in a corridor are relatively safe because they're walking past each other quite quickly. And whilst bottlenecks getting into a lecture theatre could be regarded as a problem, indeed were a problem in Bath before lockdown, the fact that your lecture theatres have now got much smaller occupancy than they did in the past means that there's no real bottlenecks. So actually that bit of the motion is quite straightforward. So the main danger in a lecture theatre is when you're in there, not getting in there or getting to it. Okay, so that was the small scale. And I should say that we're applying similar theory to schools. So a primary school, not sure that would be called in Canada, but anyway, younger children who are typically all in one group and stay in that group for the whole of the day are behaving in a somewhat similar way, and therefore similar math can be used. And the same applies to trains. So we're going to be, say, working our way, looking at the trains next week. And train travel in the UK, of course, is a primary form of transport. It's currently operating at about 20 to 30% of capacity. And people are not going to go back if they think it's dangerous. So it's important to do further work on that. Just to very quickly say what else that was covered, but very quickly, the original work, and this is still what is the case, is that the students should be put into bubbles. And so students in Bath are put into bubbles, largely associated with their tutor groups. So you have accommodation and subject bubbles, which are basically the same. And the operation is that basically they're housed and taught together and travel together as much as possible on the buses up and down the hill to the university. And not surprisingly, it makes a very big difference how big your bubble is. And we were trying to estimate what the optimal size was. There's no really good answer, because optimality for teaching and is not the same as optimality for infection. But we've ended up in Bath with a number around about 20 as a typical bubble. And if one member of the bubble gets infected, then everyone else has to isolate. One thing that's become very, very clear, again, I don't know what's happening in Canada, is that it is extremely important to do test and trace. And ideally, we'd like to test our students twice a week. That would be ideal to keep infection rates controllable. Unfortunately, at the moment, it is rather beyond anyone, and there's a lot of modelling work at the moment going on within V-KEMs, but not by me, mostly by the group led by Rebecca Hoyle, looking at different types of testing regime, whether it be asymptomatic or symptomatic, or however, how often it is. And we're looking very hard at how much test and trace there should be in the run up to Christmas, and indeed whether our students can go home at all for the Christmas period. So that's the kind of work that's going on in HE. It was, as I say, initiated, as far as I was concerned, through these workshops, but now is carrying on very much with the SPIAM group, and that's what I'll be going off to immediately after this meeting. Okay, so I'd just like to kind of say a few words in conclusion now about the rest of the work that V-KEMs is doing. So since it was sort of put together at the end of April, over 20 events have been organised, over 750 participants, and we reckon about 3 person years have been put into work on this, mostly, I should say, pro bono because of the emergency. 20 reports and proposals and whatever, and also V-KEMs has been quite active in producing popular material related to COVID to try to give the public an informed account of what's going on and the way that mathematics is being used to model things. And there's a couple of references which I'm happy to disseminate later on. One of the nice things about working in a virtual world, which we now all operate in, is that it's a much more inclusive world. So we're getting a rather higher proportion of female attendees. We can get people from industry to come that would otherwise not be able to interact because they wouldn't be able to have the time. And whilst it's mostly by mathematicians, we also have many other subjects involved, including, in fact, pure mathematics. And that's a kind of breakdown of the academic and industry and government thing. In the future, we're rather hoping that this virtual activity that has been stimulated will lead on to much more virtual activity when the epidemic goes down, and therefore it won't be it would be actually a good thing that we've learned from the epidemic, which is good ways of working with each other. And just to say, it's a very, very inclusive operation. And the virtual world also doesn't know anything about time zones. I mean, I'm speaking to you in the afternoon, it's the morning there. So what? Here we are. So it'd be lovely if we could do more collaborative work with Canada in the virtual world. Really, really pleased with that. And maybe we can operate and work together with you for virtual study groups and webinars. And if you want to find out more, either contact Dawn Wasley, who's acted as the kind of informal secretary for the group since we've been founded, or look out more on the V-KEMs website. And I shall finish. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. So first of all, congratulations for the remarkable achievement of V-KEMs. It's quite remarkable, and both in terms of activities, but also to really mobilize the national forces of mathematical powers. And I do have questions, but I think I will let Kumar to make some comments, since Chris and us are both interested in a more collaborative effort.
Right, right. So firstly, it was a fantastic talk, good overview of all the things you were doing. And we look forward to delving a little more deeply into the actual results, because we were thinking about very similar questions, obviously.
Oh, yeah.
One question I best briefly ask is the question about testing, because that, especially in schools, that becomes an issue in terms of the capacity to process tests. And you alluded a little bit to it, I think, on part of one slide, but I wonder if there's, either now or maybe later, you could tell us a little bit more about how effective that's been. Yeah.
Well, I would say, I can say a little bit, but I recommend that you invited Rebecca Hoyle to talk to you, because she's been leading the UK activity in this, and she has quite a big group that's working with her on this. I fully agree with you that the capacity problem is a huge one. I mean, if you were to test each student twice a week, well, there's 2 million students in the UK, so that means essentially testing 1 million students a day, and that's well beyond the capacity of a substantial test. We've finally got to the point where every UK student is now within walking distance of a testing centre. So that was quite a big achievement over the last month.
Wow, that's real.
When I say within walking distance, it doesn't mean it's on their campus, but they can walk to it.
Yeah.
So my university has opened up one of its buildings within the centre of Bath as a testing centre for the whole of Bath, and for the other university in Bath as well. And other places are doing the same. So it is a capacity problem. A lot of work in trying to get quicker tests, and there's a lot of work on asymptomatic tests. And then there's also the question of what's the most efficient way of doing a test. Should you combine lots of tests together, and if it comes out negative, then that's all great. You don't need to worry anymore. So yeah, there's a lot on that. I would strongly recommend that you spoke to my colleagues on that one.
Thank you. Jacques Belair, you raised your hand. So do you want to raise the question directly?
Yes. A very, very nice talk. I have both a technical and a policy question.
Yeah.
First, the technical one. How do you incorporate evolving knowledge? For example, you mentioned surfaces that have to be cleaned up.
Yeah.
Well, more recent evidence seems to be pointing out that this may be overdoing it.
Well, I mean, here's the big problem. And that's a very good question. There's a lot of literature that's coming out, of course, all the time on COVID. And one thing that's been also set up in the UK, the Royal Society set this up, is a rapid review process. So the literature is being reviewed way faster. I mean, I'm sure you're familiar with, you submit a paper and then 6 months later you get a review. The stuff is being turned around in a week now. I mean, the whole thing's, so there's being reviewed, there's a thing called the RAMP Forum, which is the results of the reviews going up quickly. So it's easier to get hold of the knowledge. And then SPIAM meets pretty regularly to assimilate this knowledge and try to kind of deal with it and then send the information out. So as with all modeling, as we all know, you have to constantly update the model as information comes in.
Yeah. Because this may be,
sorry.
Because this may become significant in terms of long-term planning and the extent to which measures will have to be in place for months, not days.
Indeed, and this is what we'll be discussing with the train operation people next week.
Okay, so the science seems to get exposed to the policymakers efficiently.
It's efficiently. Whether they then take any notice of it is another matter.
Yeah. That's the fundamental question. You do the science, you make recommendations, but you're not the politician, right?
All we can do as scientists is to say, if you do this, we think this will happen. If you do that, that will happen. At the end of the day, they have to make the decisions.
I like your use of the word exposed. The policymakers get exposed to the science. Does it infect them though?
Well, Boris did get infected, and in fact was very ill. I don't know what the equivalent's been in Canada.
Well, the closest was the wife of the prime minister.
One of my good friends, a wonderful epidemiologist called Julia Gogg, thinks that she got it from Boris. She actually caught COVID from Boris, so a small claim to fame. He shook her hand. She got ill after that.
Well, the rumor was from the actor Idba.
Okay. Any other scientific
questions?
Case.
Now, so Jock, is that a technical question?
Yes, please.
Yeah, the technical question was about updating the science.
Well, I'd say it's a sort of data assimilation problem. That all models get updated all the time, I suppose, is the way.
Yeah, because this is that's a policy discussion that's taking place. Is that the science is that the recommendations from public health are changing in time, and people are upset.
I mean, my day job, as it were, I do a lot of work on weather and climate forecasting, and it's automatic to update these all the time through data assimilation, and that's what we're trying to build into our models.
Okay.
So Chris, I have questions. Yeah, Chris, I have a question about the grocery shopping. You mentioned the number of servers, because for me, servers are simply the vector, and so there must be an optimal number.
Well, the more servers you've got to count various things. I mean, in a sense, the more servers you've got, the faster your queuing is going to be, and therefore the safer you are. You have to counter that then with the increased risk with the number of servers. So it's important that there are various groups of people that we feel need to be tested more often. So people that are coming into close contact with an open group of people really need to be tested more fairly often, and servers are one. Taxi drivers are another, bus drivers are another.
That's exactly what I'm trying to lead to. So testing should be correlated with the reopening strategies. So
yes, and that was a recommendation that we made. So teachers need to be tested fairly often. My wife, who works for the National Health Service, gets tested very often.
Okay. Are there any other comments?
Yeah, no comments. Jacques made the same comments that the time spent with distance in grocery store, for example, is absolutely ignored here. Here, me in Canada, I assume not just only in Quebec. Jack, but I totally agree. I think these kind of things, I really admire you, Chris, for the British group, that you're really talking some practical problems, really. And that,
the other thing about shopping is that it's something you can actually do experiments on, as in you can do experiments on. I find it very hard to get data out of the shops. They don't like to give out their data very much, but you can go and find your own data relatively easily.
Good. Any other questions, comments?
No, I think we're good.
So we're good. So again, maybe I can speak on behalf of Kuma and the Fields Institute and National Task Force. I want to thank you, Chris, for talking and to us, and we are looking forward to take advantage of knowing you and to build a collaborative effort.
Yeah, well, we're very, very keen to work closely with you, and I hope that we can have some sort of joint UK-Canada Field Symposium in the near future.
Great.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you again. Bye.
Thanks, Chris.